So welcome to the Natural Areas Association 2022 webinar series. I'm Maura McGinty-Kloss and I'm NAA's Director of Programs and Communications. And I'm delighted that you're joining us today. The purpose of an NAA webinars is to convey, not just to convey information, but to engage natural areas professionals on topics of interest that highlight emerging science, methodologies, and best practices. I encourage you to participate in the webinar by posting comments and questions in chat, and sometimes you post resources, and that's great too. We will address as many questions as we can at the end of the program. Also, if you're listening to this and you think of a great topic that you would love to see us pose in the future, please email us at info@naturalareas.org. So this, as you may know, is a 3-day series. We've been here Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and some of you have joined us for all three. On Tuesday, we heard from Wes Knapp and his research in the area of identifying and preventing plant extinction events. And then yesterday, Dr. Anne Francis shared important work being done to conserve crop wild relatives. And today, we will hear from Dr. Elizabeth Bach about the long-term data and outcomes from the Nachusa grasslands restoration. And as always, we want to thank the U.S. Forest Service for their support, who help us to provide all this wonderful programming to all of you. And I want to just take a couple minutes to talk about NAA for those of you who are new. We're a national nonprofit organization that serves practitioners who manage ecologically significant landscapes to protect biodiversity. Protecting natural areas in perpetuity requires quality science to inform practices and access to reliable resources. NAA provides science-based content for natural areas practitioners and researchers seeking applied science, practical solutions, and knowledge transfer related to the management of natural areas. And we share a suite of programs, products, and services that offer a broad spectrum of current and emerging issues, methodologies, and best practices in a manner that is useful and convenient to busy practitioners. Our programs are designed to achieve on-the-ground outcomes and to encourage practitioners to participate with one another. I also just want to highlight the Natural Areas Journal if you're not aware of it. It's a peer-reviewed journal that is published 4 times a year, January, April, July, and October. It's available through our website. All members get a subscription, and it's also available on BioOne. The journal July 2022 issue is currently available, but October will be published very soon. So you want to keep an eye out for that. And I just want to talk briefly about some programming we have coming up. This one we're particularly excited about. The NAA is hosting a virtual symposium called Nature's Frontline, the Role of Natural Areas in Climate Resilience in Central Appalachian Forests. It's on Friday, October 28th from 11 to 4:45 p.m. Eastern Time. And while it's focused on the Appalachian Forest, it really is a topic that is universal to everyone who works in natural areas. It will consider the role of natural areas as a critical strategic component to mitigating impacts of human-caused climate disruption, examine the science, and equip practitioners with the information needed to inform management plans, educate policymakers, and enlighten the public on the vital role natural areas play in offsetting the impacts of climate change on our planet. We're featuring some really wonderful experts in this area who spend their days studying this topic, including Dr. Reed Noss, Dr. Mark Anderson, Dr. Christopher Williams, Abigail Weinberg, and Dr. Charles LaFawn. And the symposium will be facilitated by a land management practitioner, Dr. Ryan Clough of the Virginia Natural Heritage Program. So we hope you'll check out our website and consider registering for that. We're also holding a virtual State Natural Areas Program Roundtable on November 9th. And this will be focused on forestry and wildlife management for the benefit of biodiversity. And honestly, we want to include your work. We're looking for case studies. So if you have a case or a project that highlights collaborations between wildlife biologists and foresters with multiple outcomes across multiple taxa groups, we want to hear from you. Please contact us at info@naturalareas.org before October 20th so that we can talk with you and potentially add you to the agenda. And then another thing we're excited about is we're launching a new virtual program called the Innovators in Natural Area Science Lecture, which highlights innovators in natural area science in order to communicate new scientific discoveries that contribute toward the protection of ecologically significant landscapes. So the goal is to share new and transformative research directly with land management practitioners. The program will be hosted on Zoom on Thursday, December 1st, 2022 at noon, and is going to feature a lecture from Dr. Suzanne Simard, as well as an opportunity to have a fireside chat and just share information. And now let's get to our program today. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. So Dr. Elizabeth Bach is the ecosystem restoration scientist with the Nature Conservancy in Illinois at the Nachusa Grasslands Preserve, where she works with scientists, land managers, and volunteer stewards to investigate questions about tall grass prairie restoration ecology. Her own research expertise focuses on soil ecology, exploring how below ground biology supports tall grass prairie ecosystems through plant-soil interactions and nutrient and carbon cycling. Prior to joining the Nature Conservancy, Elizabeth served as executive director for the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative and continues to contribute to global science policy work. She has a master's in plant biology from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Iowa State University. She was a postdoc with INHS in 2015-16. So now I am going to let Elizabeth take over.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for the invitation to be here and for joining me this morning to talk about the work we're doing at Nachusa Grasslands and some of the research components there. I'm joining you all this morning from my office at Nachusa Grasslands, which is located on the homelands of the Peoria, Meskwaki, Sauk, Ochehisakawan, Miami, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi people, all of whom were forcibly removed from these lands. The people of these cultures and nations, both past and present, are an integral part of the tallgrass prairie and savanna ecosystems on their landscape. Their stewardship, including regular use of fire, encouragement of grazing and agricultural practices, was central to the evolution of this ecosystem and continues to shape it today. I'd also like to acknowledge upfront my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy in Illinois, particularly my colleagues here at Nachusa Grasslands, Bill Kleiman, Cody Considine, and Dee Hudson. Dee Hudson and our volunteer Charles Larry are exceptional photographers, and you're going to be seeing several of their photos in this presentation. So thank you to them for allowing me to share these photos. I'm also going to be highlighting quite a bit of scientific work coming from collaborators here at Nachusa Grasslands, particularly work that was headed up by Pete Guyden, Holly Jones, Nick Barber, and Jen Chakravorty. So thank you to them for allowing me to weave their work into this broader story. Nachusa Grasslands is located in north central Illinois. We're about a 2-hour drive west of the Chicago region or a 2-hour drive south of the Madison, Wisconsin area. The project began in the mid-1980s with the purchase of about 400 acres of remnant tallgrass prairie, hillside prairie, and some adjacent agricultural land. Today, the preserve is over 4,000 acres, most of which has been restored tallgrass prairie habitat. The preserve is home to over 700 native plant species, 250 bird species, 270 bee species, 271 bee species, and a herd of over 100 bison. Since the initiation of Nachusa Grasslands, because it was such a restoration-focused project, monitoring and scientific exploration have been critical to helping land managers at the project formulate practices for restoration and to improve them over time. And as the project has developed, this relationship with science has only strengthened. Today, I'm going to tell you 3 data stories from Nachusa. The first is looking at a long-term collection of 20 years of plant community monitoring data. The second story will dive into effects that we've observed since the reintroduction of bison in 2014. And then finally, we'll look at the animal communities as they're responding to this restoration work that is traditionally plant-focused. I joined the team here at Nachusa Grasslands in 2018, so I'm a relative newcomer around here. When my boss, Bill Kleiman, came to the project in the early 1990s, he decided to establish several transects where plant communities could be monitored and revisited year after year to help understand how management was impacting the rare and native plant communities that already existed on the site, and to understand how restoration and planting practices were reestablishing them. This is a photo of Jerry Wilhelm and Linda Masters in 1996 conducting one of these first plant community transects. And that work has continued over 20 plus years at the site. And when I arrived in 2018, this was a data set that was clear to me deserved to be synthesized and published to help us understand the 20-year trajectory of science at Nachusa, and as part of the vision to look forward as well. Digging into this data set, I identified 12 transects that had been visited 3 or more times between 1994 and 2016. Somewhat fortuitously, this turned out to include 4 transects on native prairie or remnant prairie habitat on the preserve, 4 transects on savanna habitat, and 4 transects on planted prairies, which allowed a pretty nice balanced experimental design to evaluate these changes across these habitat types over time. All of these habitats receive frequent prescribed fire at Nachusa Grasslands. The remnant or native tallgrass prairies are treated with a little bit lighter hand. There may have been some initial removal of some encroaching brush, maybe some cedar trees or some honeysuckle, but generally these areas have just been opened up and the plant community has been allowed to thrive with regular fire since then. The savanna habitats may have been grazed or used for hunting purposes, and most of those were heavily overgrown with mesophyte woody species like honeysuckles and Siberian elms and such. The restoration work in those habitats have included a lot of active removal of that brush layer and return of fire to keep that brush in check. In some cases, there may have been some overseeding within the understory, but generally that understory has been allowed to respond to those changes on its own. The planted prairies are planted directly into former agricultural fields. They're planted with a diverse mix of locally collected native species. Most of those are all collected right here on the preserve now. Invasive species are managed in these plantings quite aggressively, and they receive regular prescribed fire once the areas are established as well. Throughout the talk today, I'm going to be sharing different metrics to evaluate the plant communities in these habitats, and one of them is called the coefficient of conservatism. Now, many of you may already be familiar with this metric, but I just like to make sure everyone in the audience is on the same page before I dive in too deep. The coefficient of conservatism is essentially a metric of plant rarity. It's a value assigned by expert botanists that reflects the affinity of a species for undisturbed habitat. At Nachusa, we're using the coefficient of conservatism values presented in the flora of the Chicago region. And you'll see me present the mean coefficient of conservatism for throughout this data set. As I dove into this data set in, I guess, 2019, I approached it with 2 central questions. Are management practices at Nachusa sustaining plant diversity, including rare plants in native prairies and savannas? And secondly, do restored prairies support comparable levels of plant diversity and conservatism or rarity compared to the native prairies? So let's take a look at the data. This is a graph of the plant communities from the native prairie plant transects. So I'm going to show several graphs like this, so just to set everybody up. The big take home of this graph is dots that are closer to each other have more similar plant communities compared to dots that are further apart. They share more species in common and similar distributions. I've color coded the transects. So all the green dots were one transect, the purple dots another transect, and so on. And the real take home message of this particular graph is that the 4 different native prairie or remnant prairie habitats had pretty distinct plant communities. They look pretty unique from each other. And we can see by the shading of these dots that these communities have shifted over the 20 years of monitoring. The bolder dots are the earliest records from the mid-90s. The more translucent or lighter dots are the most recent, typically from the mid-2010s. So if we dive into this plant community and take a look at what might be different, we can look at the total number of plant species. That's the graphs you see on the top row here. And what we found is that statistically, there wasn't much of a change except for this one transect, P19, that did show an increase in total plant species. Now, an increase in total plant species is only welcomed if that doesn't mean it's non-native or invasive plants moving in. And so the middle line is showing the proportion of native species in these remnants. And you can see that's remained consistent across the 20 years of monitoring. And in fact, in these remnants, we're often looking at 95 to 100% native plant cover. The bottom row shows this mean coefficient of conservatism or measure of rarity. And again, this only changed in one of those transects, and it was an increase in that mean C. The other plants, the other transects maintained their overall community rarity for rare plants. When we look at the savanna habitats, we see that the transects are distinct, yet they're more similar to each other than what we saw in the native prairie remnants. We do see a strong evidence of change across time in these plant communities. And when we dive into some of those diversity metrics, we found no statistical change in total plant species, the proportion of native species, or that mean coefficient of conservatism. So what's going on here? I dug in a little bit deeper and ran what we call indicator taxa analysis or indicator species analysis. And this is a statistical analysis that helps us identify plants that are particularly associated with a sampling site or at a particular sampling time. And what we found was that the data collected in the mid-90s in these savannas, the most representative species of those samples included woodies like honeysuckle, Virginia creeper, and poison ivy. However, when these transects were revisited in the mid-2010s, the species that were most identified with those transects included herbaceous understory plants like native goldenrods, sedges, and Joe pyeweeds. So what's happening here is we're actually seeing a structural shift in the understory from a woody dominated understory to an open herbaceous dominated understory. And what's happening here is replacement. The total number of species is staying the same. It's just the woodies are dropping out and the herbaceous are replacing them. Similarly, the proportion of native plants is very similar, as is this mean coefficient of conservatism. So this exemplifies how there's multiple ways to look at this plant data to understand what's going on. And from our perspective at Nachusa, this structural shift in the understory community is success. This is what we were aiming for in much of our restoration work. Moving on to the planted prairies, this one gets a little, we're leveling up in complexity here. Unfortunately, I had to visualize this in a 3-dimensional graph, which I understand is really hard to understand. So here, just think about holding a glass box, and maybe there's a flower inside of that glass box. If you look at the glass box from this angle, you can see the flower in profile. If you look at it from this angle, you get a slightly different profile. If you look at it from the top down, you can see the top probably of the flower. What I'm showing you here are 3 different angled views of the same graph. We're looking at the relationship between the planted prairies from this angle, from this angle, and from this angle. So it's the same data, same structure, just a different viewpoint. The take-home message here is that the planted prairies are fairly similar to each other. There is some distinction, but we're definitely seeing changes across time as the shading of these transects changes with the most recent studies. And when we dig into the plant community metrics here, we didn't see any statistical change in total plant species. We did see an increase in the proportion of native species in the oldest planting on the preserve, the 1987 planting. And we did see an increase in that mean coefficient of conservatism for the two oldest plantings on the preserve, the 87 and 88 plantings. So this shows us how these habitats have responded over time with restoration efforts at Nachusa. How do the native and planted prairies stack up compared to each other? So once again, we're looking at a three-dimensional graph from three different angles here. The warm colors, the yellows and reds, are the native prairies. The cool colors, the blues, are the planted prairies. And you can see they're fairly distinct from each other. Those plant communities are pretty different between the native plant and the planted prairies, although there is some overlap. And when we look at these kind of general metrics, we see that the proportion of native species in those native prairies is higher than what we're seeing in the planted prairies. And we see that that mean coefficient of conservatism is quite a bit higher in those native prairies compared to those planted prairies. So what this shows us is that our planted prairies are responding over time in the ways we'd like them to, but they're not at the same level as these remnant prairie habitats. So to answer our questions, management practices are sustaining plant diversity, including rare plants in native prairies, planted prairies and savannas. Absolutely, we're reaching our objectives for restoration and management. However, the planted prairies are not supporting comparable levels of diversity and conservatism compared to those native prairies. And what this really emphasizes is the importance of protecting and conserving the few remnant native prairie sites that still exist in the tallgrass prairie region, and augmenting that with restoration. Restoration can do a good job and probably get us 75–80% of the way there. And it's a great option in a habitat like tallgrass prairie where most of it has already been destroyed, but it is not a substitution. And all efforts should be made to protect and conserve those few examples of existing native prairie where they exist. So some folks in the audience may know about Nachusa and may know about us particularly because of the reintroduction of bison in 2014. The data I've shared with you so far all predates the bison having access to the areas where those transects were. The bison were introduced in phases on the preserve, so the 2016 data actually predated any of the bison reaching those areas. The decision to bring bison back to Nachusa was made with the aim to reintroduce a keystone species to the tallgrass prairie at Nachusa. Tallgrass prairie evolved with regular fire and grazing, and that grazing component has been missing from Illinois and from Nachusa for decades, nearly a century. The bison have access to about a third of the preserve, so it's not the entire preserve, it's just a certain area. And the herd size is maintained to keep a light grazing rate. And the goal there was based on previous scientific work from other tallgrass prairie sites that have shown this keystone role of bison in grasslands. So the question was really, how would bison grazing impact plant community? And there's three alternative hypotheses here. The first alternative is that bison grazing could increase plant diversity by suppressing dominant grasses. And in fact, this has been found in research work in tallgrass prairie and other parts of the region. Another alternative is that bison grazing could decrease plant diversity through grazing and disturbance, as sometimes is observed in areas that are overgrazed or heavily grazed by other herbivores. Or there could be a neutral hypothesis. There's no change in plant diversity with the introduction of bison. And these are the three hypotheses we were contrasting as bison were brought back to Nachusa. As this decision was being made, my colleagues spent a lot of time in conversation with scientists and grasslands ecologists, particularly Dr. John Taft and Dr. Sarah Baer. And the decision was made to create an exposure experiment and collect baseline data and repeated measures to understand how the bison grazing was directly influencing the plant communities at Nachusa. So prior to the bison coming into these areas, 22 bison exclosures were constructed. And we've collected data from baseline data, pre-bison, 1 year post-bison, 3 year post-bison, and 5 years post-bison. And the work I'm going to share with you today was synthesized by Jen Chakraborty. At the time, she was a master's student at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm working with Jen to hopefully publish these data in the near future. These exclosures are small fenced areas maintained with electrical fence using a solar charger. And that means the bison can't graze inside the fence, but they have open access to grazing outside the fence. Within each fence, there are 3 parallel transects where we do plant community composition using half-meter quadrats inside, and then compare that with 3 parallel transects outside the fence doing the same process. So sharing the data that Jen has synthesized, looking at this metric of plant diversity, the Shannon-Wiener Index, we found no differences between grazed and ungrazed habitat across any of these habitat types. So no difference from grazing. When we dug in a little more deeply to the plant community, we found some trends. I want to emphasize none of these are statistically significant. They're just visually some trends that we'd like to continue to explore as we collect data over time. In new and older planted prairies, the ratio of non-native to native species was trending higher in grazed versus ungrazed sites. And again, something we're keeping an eye on. Not a statistical difference, and some of these differences actually predated the bison introduction. So some of these are just spatial differences as well. When we look within the savanna habitat, we do see a trend towards a higher grass to forb ratio in the grazed area versus the ungrazed area. And again, this is a trend, not a statistic, and we're continuing to monitor these plots. When Jen took a look at the whole community producing one of these plots that we've seen a lot of today, she found no difference in the overall community composition between grazed and ungrazed plots. You can see the habitat types are quite different. The wetlands, the savannas, the remnant prairies, and the planted prairies all look quite distinct, and that follows some of the other data we've looked at today. But within those habitat types, there was no difference between grazed and ungrazed. So synthesizing the first 5 years of bison grazing at the site, there's been little or no impact on the plant community during that time, supporting this null hypothesis. So far, no change. Now, this is different, as I've mentioned, from some other previous work that's been done. So this is contrasting work done at Kanza Prairie in Kansas, where they did see an increase in plant diversity within the first 5 years of reintroducing grazing there in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, there are some distinct differences between the Kanza site and the Nachusa site. Particularly, I'll mention that the Shannon's diversity at Nachusa was already at a higher level when grazing was introduced. And so we may just be looking at a bit of a ceiling on where that diversity number can go. Now at Kanza, the bison have been there for almost 30 years now, and they've continued to see this distinction and increase in plant community diversity with bison grazing, and that's only grown in clarity over those years. And it's possible that at Nachusa, as we continue to monitor this for 10, 15, 20, 30 years out, that we may start to see some trends that are not evident in these first 5 years. So we're committed to continuing this monitoring, and I'm looking forward to hopefully checking in with you all again in 5 or 10 years and letting you know where we're at. So I know this series has been focused on plants as the foundation of natural areas management, and as a plant person, I tend to think about plants a whole lot, but animals are a really important part of ecosystem restoration and management as well. So for the last portion of my talk, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about restoring animal communities. I'm also realizing that I haven't prompted Moira to add a few of those resources I had in the chat. So if you would, she can provide a link to the 20-year plant monitoring paper that's been published. It's an open access publication, so anybody can download it online and view that. This next paper that I'm going to dive into has also been published. It's published in a journal that is behind a paywall, so if you don't have access to the subscription, you may not be able to access it, but certainly check through any library resources or feel free to email me and I'd be happy to send you a PDF copy of this paper. This paper was put together by Dr. Holly Jones at Northern Illinois University, Dr. Nick Barber at San Diego State University, and led by a postdoc, Pete Guyton, who's now at Hamilton College in upstate New York, and a team of really industrious graduate students who've worked with them over several years, pre and post bison introduction at Nachusa, to understand how these management effects impact not only the plant community, but multiple components of the animal community as well. And their central work is really focusing on 3 types of management work that we do here at Nachusa. First is the age of planting for our planted restorations. Doesn't matter how long they've been on a landscape for animal biodiversity. The second is prescribed fire, which I've mentioned happens regularly at Nachusa. Here they're looking at time since the last fire. And at Nachusa, most of our units are receiving fire every 2 to 3 years. So this isn't a long period of time without fire, and it's not like a treatment approach experiment where we're regulating time between fires. This is looking at the time since the last management-driven prescribed fire on a unit. And then the introduction of the bison grazing. Nick and Holly and their team started collecting data at Nachusa in 2012, prior to the bison grazing introduction. And so they were able to leverage what's called a before-after control impact experimental design to really look at these changes pre and post bison, as well as contrasting areas within the bison grazing area and outside the bison grazing area. The central questions they're addressing in this paper are: how does prairie restoration affect animal biodiversity? And is animal biodiversity shaped by management or by plant communities? And they're looking particularly at a suite of animals: small mammals, snakes, dung beetles, and ground beetles. And they took an approach that allowed them to model out the magnitude and direction of the direct effects of a management action on animal biodiversity, looking both at species diversity or taxonomic diversity and phylogenetic diversity, or the relatedness between those animals. And they were able to contrast that with a model looking at the direct effects of plant diversity on shaping those animal biodiversity components, and the indirect effects of management on plant diversity on animal diversity. And so they set this up as the field of dreams hypothesis. If you build it, they will come. If you build the plant diversity, the animal biodiversity will follow. And that's the ultimate hypothesis they were testing here. This team did a tremendous amount of work. They did plant community surveys, small mammal live trapping, snake cover boards, and invertebrate pitfall traps. Overall, examining 278 species from 5 distinct communities. So this is an incredible look at kind of a whole ecosystem perspective at Nachusa Grasslands. And they used an approach called structural equation modeling to pull this together. So I will not dive into the big, deep nuts and bolts of how this works, but the take-home message is they're able to kind of put in these path analyses and analyze for the strength and magnitude of those relationships. So as I begin to show you these next slides, a bigger, bolder line means a stronger relationship, and a skinny or narrow line means a weaker relationship, and no line means no relationship. So looking at taxonomic diversity for animals here, this is looking at the plant diversity mediated changes. So what we see here is that the age of prairie really impacted plant diversity. And in some cases, that plant diversity then filtered up to impact animal diversity. The black circles around these animal icons indicate a positive relationship. The red circles indicate a negative relationship. So for some animals like snakes and small mammals, this plant diversity correlated with higher animal diversity. For other things like the ground beetles and dung beetles, there was a negative relationship. What was interesting is when they added the direct effects from these management practices into these models, they found stronger relationships. So keep in mind, these are bigger, bolder lines. And particularly the age of the prairie is what was really a big driving factor on animal diversity overall. Fire had some effects, particularly on the small mammal community. Bison had very modest, if any, effects on the animal diversity overall. And this relationship held up when looking at the phylogenetic diversity in addition to the species or the taxonomic diversity. So this is, again, just looking at how related these animal species are together. And the idea here is to look at, are these activities benefiting a lot of similarly related animals, or are they supporting animals from a lot of different groups or different backgrounds? And here, again, that age of restoration was really the primary driver. There was some influence from the plant community, but it was a much smaller magnitude. And in fact, if you summarize the magnitude of these effects, the management-driven effects had a much higher magnitude than the plant-driven effects in terms of direct relationships on animal diversity. So to answer the questions, how does prairie restoration affect animal diversity? Management had a positive and negative effect on animal diversity, depending on what taxonomic group you were thinking about. In some cases, beetles went up, in other cases, snakes went down. And this really highlights, I think, for land managers, the conundrum of management. There's no one management that leads to greater diversity across all these groups. It's about trade-offs. The second question is animal diversity shaped by management or plant communities? The answer is really more of an and. Management practices and plant diversity influenced animal biodiversity, but the management practices were a stronger influence than the plant diversity. So at Nachusa Grasslands, the work continues. We are actively continuing the long-term plant monitoring on these transects, and we've included several additional transects for younger plantings where our planting practices have changed substantially. I'm actually collecting that data, and in the next year or two, I'm hoping to have enough data to start to ask some of those older planting, younger planting questions. Bison responses, we are looking beyond 5 years. The bison have now been here for 8 years, so we have the data in hand. And in the next couple of years, we're looking forward to synthesizing 10 years with bison grazing at Nachusa. And of course, the restoration and management work continues. Our field crew is out collecting seed for our 2022 plantings as I speak, and we're always working towards opening up more savanna habitat and creating a connected landscape here at Nachusa. Science at Nachusa is also thriving. This year, we had 40 different researchers from 16 different institutions collect data at the preserve. Nachusa data is included in over 61 peer-reviewed publications. We host an annual science symposium every year in April, which is a great opportunity for our scientists to share with one another, especially because they're often coming from different institutions and places, and also interact directly with land managers and volunteer stewards at Nachusa at that event. And in addition, the Friends of Nachusa Grasslands, an additional nonprofit that supports the work here, has really dedicated themselves to supporting science through small science grants. And the call for grants for the 2023 season is currently open. The deadline is November 31. So if there's anyone in the audience who's interested in potentially doing some research at Nachusa, I'd be happy to talk with you and connect you with those resources. And I think I have a link that can go into the chat that'll link you directly to the call for those proposals as well. So with that, I'm done talking. I look forward to questions from you all and continuing this conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That was really, really interesting. I really appreciated your presentation today. I know everyone else did as well. We do have a few questions, and I did post all the links. So any of the papers or research that Elizabeth mentioned, as well as the link to the grant opportunities, are all in chat. They will also be sent, as you know, everyone who registers for a webinar, they are sent a link and the resources. So let's get to the questions. Where the native bison has been reintroduced, does fire alternate with bison grazing? I guess just asking more how that integrates.
Yeah, really good question. So yeah, at Nachusa Grasslands, the bison have open access to 1,500 acres, and we let them choose where they want to graze within those 1,500 acres. We burn within that 1,500 acres. We don't burn it all. We burn a portion of it. And so the bison, we do see them choosing to graze those freshly burned areas early in the spring and maintaining grazing lawns in certain areas. And we see those grazing lawns shifting year to year. They're not always in the same place, but we let the bison make those choices. We're not intentionally moving them from pasture to pasture or putting them on a strict, burn, no burn rotation. Okay.
And then thank you for addressing the first and third kingdom of life, plants and animals. But what about the second kingdom of life, fungi?
Fungi. I love fungi. That's a whole nother talk. I could go on for probably an hour about that. Really great question. There is some really interesting fungal work happening at Nachusa. Some of its work I'm actively involved in. My background is more soil ecology oriented. I didn't package them into this talk because I was trying to get a bigger ecosystem picture going here, but yes, mycorrhizal fungi certainly play a big role in restoration and sustainability of habitats. We're aware of that. We've had several surveys of mycorrhizal fungi on the site. We did have a postdoc out a couple of years ago who actually was finding some differences between fire and grazing and the types of mycorrhizal spores that he was finding in the soil. That work's hopefully going to be published soon and will be exciting to share. We also know that the fungal diversity in those remnant prairie habitats is pretty distinct from the restored prairie habitats. That actually follows some of that plant data pretty nicely. What's interesting is when you start looking at what fungi are doing in terms of decomposition and carbon and nitrogen cycling, functionally, they're behaving very similar. We see the functions in the planted prairie and the remnant prairie as very similar. So this opens a really interesting conversation, from this below ground community where your diversity is thousands of fungal taxa as opposed to hundreds or dozens of plants or animals. And I think, again, right now, the take home message is, yep, those remnant habitats are really special. We should be protecting them and conserving them. But the restorations are accomplishing a lot and really a great option, especially when a habitat that's already been destroyed as much as tallgrass prairie has. So that's a few tidbits about fungi. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk further about fungi in a different webinar.
Well, take note of that. Any data on bird communities?
Another really good question, the bird communities. We have been doing bird community work. A couple of graduate students with Holly Jones have done some really great work with that. And some of that work is published. It's birds get complicated. They're much more mobile compared to the small mammals and snakes and insects that was synthesized in that project I talked about here. And so part of that is that it's much harder to find trends with bird data. And so we have been collecting bird data. So far, there hasn't really been anything that's filtered out that we can really attribute to bison grazing, particularly, or even prescribed fire. The variation from year to year is enough that it's really hard to actually pull these trends out. What we have noticed is that nesting success has actually been a little higher in the bison grazed areas, at least in the first few years when that project was happening. And then there's a master's student who's just wrapped up a project looking at bird diversity more broadly across the preserve. And that's something I'm not going to have a clear take home off the top of my head on where that one landed, but we have been collecting bird data, and yeah, hopefully in the future I can put together a really nice bird story. The long and the short of it is it's complicated data and it's kind of messy, and so it's hard to make a nice, clear take home message about it.
Okay. Do you need to manage the number of bison?
We do, yeah. We do keep the herd at a consistent size, about 100 adults, and then calves come on every year. So we do transfer animals off of the preserve each year to maintain that. Yeah.
Okay. And then is diversity in and of itself always beneficial, or is there a kind of weighted proportion of desirability among genre, SPP, et cetera? Or maybe this is an encapsulated in functional diversity?
Really good question. I think this is a really worthy conversation to have, in that diversity in and of itself isn't necessarily the be all and end all. And you can certainly have situations where you actually have increased diversity because you have an increase in non-native and invasive species. And so that's part of why I also really wanted to couple some of those metrics with things like the proportion of native species and that coefficient of conservatism to try and capture some metrics around the type of, I guess in the end, desired community, the representation of what a tallgrass prairie ecosystem looks like, and recognizing that that isn't homogeneous across the landscape, that actually it's healthy that our remnants look pretty different from each other, and that we may have some areas with a really high diversity and other areas that have less. That can be a really okay and good thing. So yes, I don't think diversity is necessarily the only goal it'll be going for. It's really important to think about the structure. I think of the savannas are a great example. Diversity-wise, nothing's changed, but we've certainly ecologically made some pretty significant changes in those areas. So yeah, I feel like I agree with you, and encourage everyone to present that in a nuanced way.
Okay. So this is the last question I have. So if anybody has any additional questions, please post them in chat. But would you consider following animal diversity from unplanted through first year and beyond?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think. So Holly Jones's team has collected some data from some agricultural sites. So I think that there's a situation where we could be making that comparison. And yeah, so I think we have agriculture and probably year 1, year 2, and then some older sites. So there is a way you can slice that data. And in fact, I'm curious about some of the earlier work I'm thinking of, maybe published by Angie. I'm going to blank on her last name. Anyway, there is some work that looks at that small mammal data broken down more from an age perspective, more of what we might call a chronosequence approach. And I can look up that paper and see if that answers that question and send it out as an email afterwards. But that is something they've looked at. My understanding is there's some subtle changes. The most common small mammal that team finds is the deer mouse, which is pretty generalist and is happy to live in a cornfield as it is happy to live more or less in a prairie. The big thing that they see in terms of like differences in small mammal communities is actually in response to fire. And there's a trade-off between the voles and the mice. The voles are better competitors and can outcompete the mice, but they like having a thick thatch layer. They're pretty sensitive to predation. And so in an area where you've done a prescribed fire and you've burned away all the thatch, the voles leave and go find areas where there's a thick thatch cover layer. So the mice can tolerate that openness, and the release of competition from the voles is actually a positive for them. So what we see is the deer mice in recently burned areas, the voles in not recently burned areas, and they kind of chase each other around the landscape. When a fire happens, the voles leave, the mice move in, and vice versa.
Okay. So we did get another question. Have you seen Franklin's ground squirrel at your site?
That's a really good question. There was an effort in the mid-90s to try and relocate some Franklin's ground squirrels to this area. We have not had a confirmed sighting in the past probably 15 years. So we're skeptical that worked, but the Franklin's is a hard species. It spends most of its time underground, but it's not one that we've seen regularly, but it has been one we're kind of always on the lookout for.
Okay. Well, that wraps up for questions. Thank you again for joining us today. I know everyone truly appreciated the presentation and the great data. And so thank you. And just a reminder, everybody will get a copy of this presentation as well as all the resources. So Elizabeth, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week, and we hope to hear from you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.